Good afternoon. Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba. In the most significant changes in our policy in more than 50 years, we will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead, we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. That was President Obama late last year announcing closer relations with communist Cuba. This week in Panama, the presidents of Cuba and the U.S. will not only attend the Summit for the Americas, but they will meet publicly. However, questions remain. What will normalized relations mean for the people of Cuba, particularly their religious and human rights? And what about the embargo? Joining us to discuss in D.C. is the Director of Global Liberty and Prosperity at the Cato Institute, Ian Vasquez. And from New Orleans, the General Counsel and Vice Chairman of the Cuban American National Foundation, George Fowler. Gentlemen, thank you for both being here. Ian, I want to start with you. Why is now the perfect moment to normalize these relations? Why now?
Well, Cuba's communist economy has never been able to survive without an outside patron. And during the Cold War, it was the Soviet Union that provided billions of dollars in assistance. And since the last 15 or so years, it's been the Venezuelan regime that has provided that. With the falling price of oil and the economic crisis and the political crisis in Venezuela, Cuba has had to look elsewhere to see where it could get some help. And in times like these, it tends to introduce minor reforms that I don't think go far enough. But this is the time that Cuba seemed to be more open to normalizing relations with the United States than in the past. And in the United States, the majority of Americans now think that this is the right thing to do, including an increasing number of Cuban Americans, and that makes a difference.
George Fowler, would you agree?
No, I don't agree, respectfully. I left Cuba when I was 9 years old. And I've been trying to get Fidel Castro out of Cuba for the last 56 years. He's been a dictator with over 18,000 political assassinations and 500,000 people in prison out of a population then of 7 million. He came down from the mountains with a crucifix around his neck, proclaiming that he was a Christian, that he was not a communist, and he lied. Regrettably for the Cubans in and out of Cuba, and for Americans, Fidel Castro, not Raul Castro, he's not in power. Fidel Castro is in power, and he's in charge. And this December 17th announcement of President Obama is unfortunately not going to go anywhere. First of all, because it requires congressional approval, and I don't think this Congress is going to allow it.
Well, to lift the embargo requires congressional approval.
Yeah, to lift the embargo. But the fact of the matter is that within days of the meeting between Raul Castro and Fidel Castro appeared, came on and said, I don't trust Americans. And I have nothing to do with this discussions. And within a few days, Raul Castro, who does everything that Big Brother tells him to say, said, oh, by the way, on the table for negotiations for what I refer to as abnormal relations, you have to return Guantanamo to the Castro dictatorship, and you have to pay $1 trillion in embargo reparations. They claim that the United States owes them $1 trillion. So Fidel Castro moved the goalposts out of the football field.
Okay, let me bring,
as far as
George, let me bring Ian in on this point. Coming out of this, Raul Castro did say, we want reparations, we want Guantanamo Bay back. Isn't that a deal breaker? Isn't he conveying the message that this is not going to happen?
Well, I think that's one of the benefits of what President Obama is doing. The United States is calling the Castros bluff. The Castros have always complained about the embargo. They've always blamed it for all the troubles that Cuba suffers, and they've used as a very convenient excuse to explain away the problems in Cuba that are actually caused by their own repressive policies. And now that they are being given this policy change by the United States, they react in this manner. And so I think that this is one of the benefits of showing where the real problem lies in Cuba. The problems for Cubans are caused by the Castro regime itself and not the embargo. Lifting it will clarify that.
I want to go to George for a moment on this key point of human and religious rights, George. It was advertised that Pope Francis was the prime mover here, or the first mover. He sort of facilitated this conversation and encouraged it between Cuba and the U.S. Where is the human rights dimension of this, and what is the state of human and religious rights in Cuba?
Well, a significant part of my life is to work with the dissident movement in Cuba, particularly human rights dissidents. The ladies in white, the wives and the mothers of the political prisoners in Cuba, are beaten up every Sunday at St. Rita's Catholic Church. They parade dressed in white and with flowers in their hands, and Castro sends his goons to beat them up. So there are no human rights, there are no civil rights in Cuba. Zero. They haven't been for 56 years in Cuba. And Castro's not going to change his ways, because Castro's only goal is not the welfare of the Cuban people. His only goal is to stay in power, and he's been very successful at staying in power. So imagine 56 years of President Reagan, or 56 years of President Obama. But that's what we have in Cuba.
But George Fowler and Ian, he can't stay in power forever. I mean, Fidel Castro and Raul's 83. The older brother's older. I mean, how long can they hold on to power? And does lifting the embargo only empower the Castro regime?
Well, I agree with what he said. I mean, this is a regime that continuously violates human rights. And that was the case under the embargo. The embargo did nothing to improve that situation. Lifting the embargo may do nothing to improve that situation either. I don't think that it can make things worse. I think that it's hard to imagine a policy that would fail worse than the many decades that actually didn't lead to economic changes, democratization, or even dislodging the Castro regime. But lifting the embargo may not accomplish that much either, other than taking away that excuse that the Castro brothers have used. And I think that that's something that we should recognize. It is not really under the power of the United States government to make wholesale changes in Cuban society.
Yeah, but I mean, part of your argument, part of the arguments I've heard around D.C. is that lift the embargo, it will bring more trade, and by force, just by the nature of the markets, you'll see a flowering of democracy, and the people who are under the boot will have...
I don't think that's going to happen.
You don't
in
think
Cuba under the Castro regime? Absolutely not. I think that that's one of the reasons why I don't think lifting the embargo is going to empower the regime. Until and unless the regime actually introduces policy changes, that is, changes some of the worst economic policies on record and changes the nature of the regime, it's not going to be a good place to trade and invest. That's just the way that market economics works.
George Fowler, would you agree with that? Leave the embargo in place or lift it?
No, it's not going to make any difference, because ultimately the Castro regime is the one that owns and controls everything. So the Ministry of Tourism, the military controls tourism. So all the dollars go into Castro's pockets when people travel over there. The Cuban people make $20 a month. Castro charges international rates, say $1,000 a month for a Cuban worker, takes that money but only pays the Cuban worker $20 a month. So the Cuban people live impoverished, working every day to try to get food. I mean, even issues of civil liberties, human rights are not, they're concerned with just plain eating. And so the Castro government is not going to allow, 3 million Americans in Hawaiian plaid shirts to go to Cuba and roam. When Americans visit Cuban hotels, Cubans are not allowed to go to the hotel. People don't understand that. And frankly, the biggest problem that we have on the Cuba issues is an ignorance, a lack of understanding of just how cruel this dictatorship is. It is right now. We have a summit of the Americas. Supposedly, President Obama and Raul Castro are going to meet. But yesterday, they beat up some of my friends that were demonstrating against the Castro regime. He actually sent goons into Panama, and they beat up my friends.
I want to give everybody 1 minute here. I only have 2 minutes left. The Pope, when he was there, John Paul II, St. John Paul II, said it's time for Cuba to open itself to the world and for the world to open itself to Cuba. Well, the world has opened itself to Cuba. I mean, it's been trading with Canada and Russia and Europe for years. The free market magic hasn't worked there, has it? And now they're having to forgive billions of dollars of debt that Cuba's holding.
The free market doesn't exist in Cuba. It's a communist economy. That's why I say that lifting the embargo in and of itself is not going to make much of a difference. The answer ultimately is in the hands of Cubans themselves. The Cubans have to change the situation there, and that's not likely to happen in any meaningful way unless and until the regime does it, or which is another way of saying until the Castro brothers
go to their maker. George Fowler, would you agree with that? 1 minute.
Yeah, let me just say clear one thing up. From December 17th, President Obama and Raul Castro both gave credit to the Pope. I have been looking in the internet, and I did it again yesterday. I haven't found one word from the Pope on this issue. They both want to tar their relationship with Pope Francis. Pope Francis is an Argentinian. He understands the Latin American dictator better than most. I haven't seen anything about what he said exactly. Well, I am sure he said he wants peace, but
yeah,
very little information.
Here's the full communique from the Vatican Secretary of State, just to set the record straight. The Holy Father wishes to express his warm congratulations for the historic decision taken by the governments of the U.S. and Cuba to establish diplomatic relations with the aim of overcoming, in the interest of its citizens, both countries, the difficulties which have marked their recent history. That's about it.
Well, you know, if the United States lifted the travel embargo, that could make a marginal difference in favor of freedom, because it would bring hundreds of thousands, maybe up to 1 million Americans per year to Cuba, and that would establish personal relationships. It would spur the informal economy. It would make some amount of Cubans more independent of the state, and I think that would be positive. But it would be a marginal improvement.
Ian Vasquez, George Fowler, thank you both for being here.